For centuries, the soundscape of Christian worship was as predictable as the architecture that housed it, anchored by the steady drone of pipe organs and structured poetry. But in the late 20th century, that predictable sanctuary was suddenly shattered by a sonic revolution that disrupted the historic musical traditions of the church. The introduction of drums, electric guitars, and raw Jesus music didn't just alter playlists. It ignited a fierce generational civil war over the very soul of the church. The landscape of Christian liturgy underwent a seismic transformation in the latter half of the 20th century, a period marked clearly by deeply shifting cultural paradigms. For centuries, Protestant worship was anchored by traditional hymnody, formal liturgical rubrics, and a highly predictable structural architecture that governed weekly corporate gatherings. However, the closing decades of the millennium introduced a profound friction between inherited musical traditions and emerging contemporary expressions, sparking intense debates across local congregations. This tension, colloquially termed the worship wars, was far more than a superficial disagreement over aesthetic preferences alone or specific types of musical instrumentation. Instead, it represented a fundamental negotiation regarding ecclesial identity, generational continuity, and the complex internal mechanisms of long-term theological transmission within the body. These turbulent decades served as the indispensable incubator for contemporary worship practices, permanently altering how future generations would gather to praise God globally. The genesis of contemporary worship is frequently misattributed to a linear evolution of older Protestant revivalism, obscuring the mid-20th century developments that served as a flashpoint. Instead, the shift traces back to mid-20th century developments, with the 1960s serving as the primary flashpoint of cultural and ecclesiastical upheaval across a diverse spectrum of congregations. During this watershed decade, a unique convergence of societal factors fostered an environment ripe for structural experimentation that quickly spread across a wide and diverse spectrum of congregations. The macrocultural landscape of the 1960s featured a potent counterculture that destabilized traditional societal frameworks, primarily driven by a profound and painful fracturing of generational transmission. As the link between generations broke, deep skepticism toward established institutions emerged, leaving the traditional church viewed by youth as bureaucratic, rigid, and deeply detached from reality. Music became the primary vehicle for this cultural critique, as new genres like folk rock, and rock offered a raw, unmediated medium for youth to share existential concerns. Consequently, formal corporate worship reliant upon 18th and 19th century hymns appeared profoundly antiquated to a younger generation that viewed the inherited repertoire as bound to old systems. This inherited repertoire seemed inextricably bound to the very institutions the younger generation sought to dismantle, rendering traditional liturgies completely culturally inaccessible to an alienated and wandering demographic. As countercultural energy waned in the 1970s, its liturgical implications diffused unevenly, with mainline Protestant congregations largely seeking to preserve historical frameworks, while momentum shifted toward independent evangelical churches. This transformation was driven by the convergence of the charismatic renewal and the Jesus movement, which favored experiential intimacy and spontaneous expression over inherited liturgical patterns and structures. This synthesis incubated in new physical spaces like coffee houses, where musicians like Larry Norman composed worldview-framed protest music entirely outside the boundaries and constraints of traditional sanctuaries. As these alternative communities solidified into organized churches, they abandoned classical rubrics, ultimately embracing Jesus music as the new normative standard for corporate praise during weekly gatherings. During the 1980s, rapid institutionalization secured the movement's dominance as emerging megachurches functioned as paradigm models and teaching hubs, providing scale to validate alternative worship models. Simultaneously, A robust commercial infrastructure of publishing houses, recording labels, and distribution networks rapidly transformed localized musical expressions into a highly accessible, cross-denominational consumer commodity. To secure intellectual legitimacy, Pentecostal theologians formulated a rigorous theoretical undergirding, arguing that contemporary praise possessed a distinct sacramental function rather than being mere casual entertainment. Rather than treating it as a church growth tool, they proved it facilitated unmediated encounters, as contemporary worship transitioned from a marginal counterculture into an institutionalized liturgical force. The mid-20th century liturgical revolution received an unexpected, powerful impetus from the absolute center of Western ecclesiastical tradition, fundamentally reshaping how the global church would approach corporate gatherings forever. Structural changes within the Roman Catholic Church, coupled with 1960s societal transformations, altered the global worship landscape in a manner completely unprecedented since the Protestant Reformation centuries prior. The groundwork for Catholic liturgical renewal began in 1948 when Pope Pius XII established a commission explicitly tasked to study comprehensive and highly systemic structural reform across the global church. This extensive work culminated in the 1963 historic promulgation of the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, which instantly brought sweeping systemic alterations to traditional Catholic worship practices. Chief among these was the historic transition from Latin to the vernacular, effectively enabling diverse local congregations to hear and actively participate in worship using their own language. The council also mandated a profound restoration of preaching, introduced entirely new worship texts, and willingly incorporated fresh musical forms to engage ordinary people during the weekly service. The primary philosophical motivation was reclaiming active congregational participation, as worship was intentionally returned to the laity through corporate singing, vocal prayers, and shared liturgical responses. These modifications integrated historical liturgy with contemporary culture, successfully breaking down the rigid barriers that had long separated the sacred sphere from ordinary, everyday human experience entirely. The structural shockwaves of Vatican II quickly breached Catholic borders, deeply altering Protestant worship trajectories across thousands of individual local congregations and entire long-standing historical denominations. For centuries, Protestant identity was defined against Catholic practice. However, when the Catholic Church suddenly embraced the vernacular and indigenous musical styles, it profoundly shifted the global reference point. Protestant leaders observed a historic global institution dismantling formal barriers to enhance accessibility, which provided immense validation to Protestant groups already actively experimenting with new expressive musical forms. Consequently, Vatican II acted as a powerful legitimizing agent, significantly accelerating the dismantling of traditional structures and paving the way for future commercial and institutional church branding. In the 1990s, localized musical innovations materialized into a massive institutional explosion across the global church, completely altering how local congregations approach corporate gatherings. Congregations transitioning toward contemporary worship no longer had to invent practices from scratch. Rather, they replicated successful megachurch models supported by a booming market of published resources. The standardization of the term contemporary worship by the mid-1990s enabled the phenomenon to be aggressively branded, promoted, and systematically pushed into mainstream church culture. This labeling established a stark binary with what was retroactively called traditional worship, sparking bitter, systemic worship wars across thousands of individual congregations and entire denominations. Despite internal friction, the movement's momentum was unstoppable as the instructional and theological literature expanded exponentially to meet the overwhelming cultural demand across the country. The cultural pressure to adapt became so pronounced that even historically conservative evangelical bodies and mainline denominations began implementing contemporary options to stem youth losses. A defining liturgical innovation of the 1990s was the codification of flow theory, acting as a psychological and spiritual methodology designed to orchestrate corporate emotional experiences. Pioneering voices like Don McMinn articulated a formalized structural pattern, moving from thanksgiving into active praise and ultimately culminating in deeply intimate and focused worship expressions. McMinn emphasized eliminating dead space between songs to facilitate an uninterrupted aesthetic experience, allowing the congregation to remain deeply engaged without any cognitive or structural distractions. Writers like Tom Crater constructed robust theological justifications for this methodology, arguing that music functions specifically to gather and focus fractured human attention during corporate gatherings. Crater categorized flow not as a marketing gimmick for church growth, but rather as a vital, necessary mechanism for deep and lasting spiritual formation within believers. By the late 1990s, highly influential megachurches repackaged these theories into easily replicable corporate systems, hosting massive national conferences to promote alternative and innovative models. In 1999, Saddleback Church promoted its highly structured impact paradigm, utilizing bright, fast-tempo songs to instantly awaken the room and physically engage the corporate congregation. Moving through energetic declarations directed toward God's character, the framework then shifted into slower, deeply intimate melodies designed to foster internal proximity and spiritual stillness. Creating space for individuals to express total self-dedication, the service concluded with a targeted song after the sermon that unifies the message and gathering completely. The rigid internal logic of this paradigm demonstrates that contemporary worship had surely evolved far beyond a random collection of popular and highly requested radio songs. It had become a highly sophisticated, intentionally engineered liturgical engine, explicitly designed to guide human affections through the precise and calculated application of musical flow. To evaluate the contemporary worship movement, one must look past its diverse styling and instead identify its foundational deep Pentecostal genetic code that governs its operation. This hidden genetic framework actively drives practitioners toward three primary objectives, namely reaching the unchurched, fostering deep emotional intimacy, and expanding missional formation globally. Within third wave and Pentecostal charismatic movements, corporate music does not function as a mere ornamental prelude. Rather, it serves as the vital center of identity. Corporate music making serves as the primary mechanism through which this religious network constitutes itself, replicates its specific worldview, and successfully alters the environments its members inhabit. Consequently, an authentic comprehension of this massive and global Christian modality is completely impossible without a meticulous, highly detailed examination of its songs and internal patterns. The foundational impetus of this movement traces directly back to the raw poetic shifts of the 1960s counterculture, which fundamentally upended the secular social landscape. Emerging Jesus music mirrored that cultural honesty, birthing songs that rejected rigid religious pretense in favor of blunt vulnerability, giving birth to a brand new era. Consequently, emerging churches abandoned historical liturgical pacing, restructuring their entire corporate identity around extended, completely uninterrupted blocks of singing and deeply emotive personal response. This structural restructuring offered ordinary participants a profound freedom from rigid formalism while simultaneously providing therapeutic relief from daily existential pressures and heavy societal anxieties. By intentionally echoing secular musical trends, contemporary worship renders the church environment far less foreign or intimidating to the unchurched seeker looking for real hope. Simultaneously, it rescues the lifelong believer from culturally insulated or emotionally detached traditions, thereby providing a highly accessible path back into authentic corporate devotion. The systematic exportation of this charismatic worship architecture was catalyzed by the Vineyard movement, originally founded in California by the influential church leader John Wimber. As a result, thousands of traditional or non-charismatic churches that completely reject Pentecostal theology have nevertheless imported a liturgical framework directly shaped by those movements. This global diffusion has accelerated due to recording advancements and rapid digital distribution, which paired with global migration patterns transformed the paradigm into a universal brand. A powerful secondary orality, driven by audiovisual media networks and streaming services, allows these musical materials to effortlessly traverse international boundaries and interdenominational barriers alike. A significant fruit of this musical mobilization has been its ability to convert sung commitments into tangible, real-world action, fueling an activist fire among young believers. Prominent movements anchored in distinct demographics, such as Soul Survivor and Passion, have profoundly altered how young believers view their direct responsibility to the wider social order. Similarly, the global impact of movements like March for Jesus has demonstrably reshaped the church's public posture within wider society, displaying a brand new cultural witness. In all these instances, contemporary worship songs provide the unifying gathering point and the essential emotional driving force behind highly coordinated acts of systemic social impact. This remarkable capacity to transform sung devotion into real-world missional action marks the high point of the modern movement's success across many diverse local communities. Over a few turbulent decades, contemporary worship rewrote the aesthetic DNA of the global church, successfully breaking down rigid institutional barriers and traditional structural frameworks. It created an incredibly accessible, emotionally resonant pathway to God. However, this rapid market-driven evolution came with a hidden and deeply significant theological cost. By prioritizing emotional accessibility and musical flow over deep historical architecture, did the movement inadvertently strip modern corporate worship of its long-term structural theological substance? This brings us to the end of part 1 of Hymns versus Contemporary Worship, the real history of the worship wars and of our exploration into this profound legacy. Before we transition, reflect on your own communities. Does your current corporate worship style genuinely form you for your weekly vocation or function as an escape? Are we building cross-generational sanctuaries of true unity, or are we quietly fracturing the body of the church into highly isolated demographic target markets? The story does not end with cultural triumph. In part 2, Hymns versus Contemporary Worship, the hidden cost of modern praise, we will pull back the curtain. We will examine the formative deficiencies, vocational gaps, and digital frontiers that are forcing a massive modern reckoning across the global church landscape today.